Welcome to the Bestiary, your one-stop shop for monster lore, info, and shenanigans. Join us as we take you through today's special feature.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Bestiary. My name is Morgan. I am here with Jonathan, who you can't see today because his camera's down.
Internet problems are really annoying, but hello, everybody.
And we've got Kayvon, who is also deciding not to use his camera, so...
Hey, everybody.
Oh, there he is. Hello, Kayvon.
Hey there.
And our special guest today is Ketih Ammann. Did I pronounce that right?
Ammann.
Ammann. There we go. So, John, do you want to do the introduction since you're so good at them?
Yeah, absolutely. Ketih Ammann is, I'm really excited to have him on the show today because when we started the Bestiary and we started doing research into these monsters, Ketih's site was one of the first sites we found, and we have actually used it pretty extensively in our research. So he already feels like one of the team. Ketih is the creator of the blog, The Monsters Know What They're Doing, which has since become a book. You can order it on Amazon. We'll make sure to drop links on the podcast page when we go live. And Ketih is also, well, I should explain, I guess, a little bit about what the blog does. The blog takes every monster, Ketih, from the Monster Manual?
Not every monster, most of them. And the book fills in a number of those that the blog doesn't cover.
And I think the book is like 520 pages, if I'm not wrong.
544.
So you
Dang.
get 544 pages. And what Ketih has done is he has taken, for each monster, he has gone into it and he explores kind of the psychology and a little bit of the culture of the monster. And it's all geared towards understanding how they would react in a combative situation. But it's based, I mean, obviously he's using the stats and he's kind of telling you what you can do with them that's interesting, but he's also saying, here's how they would react and why. And I absolutely love that. It's always a joy to read. And recently, Ketih, you're also, you've kind of, because your site really helps out the DMs. A lot of people who use the site will say how it makes their monsters way more deadly because the tactics are almost always very, very intelligent and based on kind of attacking the party from multiple angles. So you've also released a book for the players.
Well, so a little background on that.
Yes, please.
I actually wrote the first version of Live to Tell the Tale some time ago. I want to say back in 2017. And I did it because I was, like you said, realizing that going into the monster tactics the way I did made things significantly more difficult and deadly for the players, and my sense of fairness started to eat at me, especially when I started to get feedback from DMs telling me that they used my site and got a TPK out of it. And I'm I'm thinking, but
Oops.
I wasn't trying to teach people how to get TPKs. I was trying to teach them how to give their monsters more verisimilitude.
You weren't writing TPK, the how-to guide?
I wasn't writing a party death manual. At least that's not what I intended. But you know, when you up the tactical sophistication of the monsters, it's only fair to let the players know how they can up their tactical sophistication. And so I wrote Live to Tell the Tale as an ebook that I self-published, and I later on, after Xanathar's came out, wrote a revised edition of that. And then when I was approached to do The Monsters Know What They're Doing as a trade book, Live to Tell the Tale was part of the package, and this edition coming out is not only more than a PDF with no art. It's going to have new sections on stealth and perception, mounted combat, advantage and disadvantage, and some other things, plus a higher level sample battle in addition to the previous three. So it's going to be meatier.
And Live to Tell the Tale is a book about player tactics, correct? That's a book where you kind of
Correct.
go into how to use different classes and what they can do in combat.
Yeah, and it's somewhat more introductory than the monsters know what they're doing is. It's really geared toward giving players an education in the fundamentals, which isn't to say that it's only for novice players, because I think anyone who participates in an activity that involves disciplined practice, if chess players, musicians, athletes, whatever, will always tell you that there's benefit to be had in going back to the fundamentals and coming to them fresh with the benefit of experience. And so I think there's some of that in there for non-beginning players as well.
And before we launch into today's topic, I had one more question for you about this. I would really love to know where did this whole project, the monsters know what they're doing, where did this come out of? What was the inspiration?
The inspiration was my own dissatisfaction with how a couple of my early combats had gone when I started playing 5e with the group I'm playing with now. Realizing that I didn't have a full understanding of how, just to take the first example on the blog and the first example in the book, goblins. If you play Lost Mine of Phandelver, spoiler alert, you run into goblins. And
if you play Dungeons and Dragons, spoiler alert, you're going to
run into goblins. Yeah, but they are the first enemy you run into in Lost Mine of Phandelver, and you run into them in a couple of different situations. And I had felt like there was something missing, and it wasn't a satisfying combat encounter to me. And so I felt like I wanted to understand for my own benefit what I should have been doing. Part of this is fuzzy in my memory because I don't even remember exactly what all my motivations were.
It's been so long.
I knew it has been a while, and I knew that I just wanted to write. I just needed to write, and I needed to write on a regular basis. And because I had thought if I was doing this analysis for myself, that there might be other people out there who would enjoy reading it as well, and who would benefit from it. And it took a while. I started noticing occasional spikes in my site traffic, and there's a WordPress offers a limited ability to see where your hits are coming from, like who your referrers are. And I noticed that a lot of them seemed to be coming from Reddit. And I followed back up those Reddit referrals and saw people responding to queries like, I'm going to be running some gnolls. What should I do about this? And people replying to that, go read this blog. He talks about that. And getting a lot of, that was when I started realizing that people were actually using it for reference. And that changed my whole perspective on what it was I was doing. And really was a big boost, for confidence and the thought that I was really providing something of value.
I love it. You were raised up by the common man, which actually takes us into our topic, because today our
smooth segue.
Our monster is one that I think every party has faced, even more than goblins. They have all faced the dreaded commoner, which I would love to know, why did you pick the commoner today for your focus?
I think I was definitely being contrarian. There are lots of monsters that are really interesting. There are lots of monsters that have really deep lore. How do you choose? You just kind of got to go to the other end, and the other end of the complexity spectrum, because doesn't get any simpler than the commoner. They have 1 hit die and no skills. All of their ability scores are straight average, but they fulfill all sorts of roles in an adventure. And I don't think that enough thought and attention is given to the commoners. So
Well, I kind of have a question about that. So the first experience that I think most players and DMs, really, let's say DMs, the first experience most DMs have as commoners is they sort of become the playthings of the players. Like you throw this town at your, I mean, I remember my first DMing experience was kind of presenting this well thought out town, and the players came into it and immediately they started just exerting control over the commoners. It was like they were menacing them. I kind of compare this to a video game in my mind. Like in a video game, our list of verbs, the way we can interact with the world is sort of limited. So, in most games, some you can, but in most you can't go in and, burn down the hut of the merchant or murder the local, priest or whatever. But
they have plot armor.
They have programming armor.
Quest givers have plot armor.
But what's interesting kind of is in D&D, where we're given absolute freedom over our actions, over our verbs. Why do you think, Keith, that so many players turn to this and they treat the commoner like as bad as a noble would? Worse.
Probably because the DM doesn't show them that they shouldn't. There is no, in my opinion, there is no party of murder hobos out there that isn't enabled by a DM that lets them murder hobo. I mean,
fair.
It's something that if you don't want your players to do that, and not all players will be inclined to do something like that, but especially when they're younger, there are types of players who will just naturally gravitate toward this. Oh, well, I am a more advanced being than these NPCs. I'm going to just lord it over them and abuse them to my heart's content. It's the responsibility of the DM to show them, not just tell them, but to show them why they should not do that. But we're not here to talk about guards today.
The level 2 commoner.
Yeah, but it's not to say that commoners can't stand up for themselves either. In looking at the commoner for the monsters know what they're doing, I drew on some of the work of the psychologist Karen Horney, who had a sort of a limited personality typology with just 3 categories: moving toward others, moving away from others, and moving against others. Or, in other words, a cooperative or a compliant type, a withdrawn type, and an aggressive type. And if you project this onto the commoner and say, what is a commoner going to do in a situation whether they're faced with a threat? And that threat may come from the PCs, it may come from a monster, it may come from another group of commoners from another country. You never know. Any sort of threat that they have to deal with, they may flee, they may fight back, they may freeze, which is something you see surprisingly often in real life in response to unexpected threats or catastrophes. There are people who run, there are people who dig in and fight, and then there are people who just stand there not knowing what to do. One of the interesting things is that if you're playing this out as a set piece, like let's say you're doing a Horde of the Dragon Queen or something, and the dragon is attacking greenest, you can have commoners, you can have villagers doing all 3 of these things. You can have some of them actually trying to fight. You can have some of them running willy-nilly screaming, and you can have some of them just standing there frozen in terror. And that doing all three is going to add depth to your scene.
Keith, I have to ask a question about that real quick, because we have a lot of young DMs who listen to the podcast, and I'm always trying to find ways to kind of give them advice on how to run these great scenarios that our guests lay out. I love what you're talking about there with the townsfolk. As a DM, would you do all this through description, just saying, or would you actually have these, townsfolk interact with the players? How would you work that scene without letting it become too overwhelming in terms of actually having to run numbers and all that?
Some of both. But generally speaking, the commoners who are fighting in a scene like that, you don't need to actually resolve their combat through die rolls. It's just action going on in the background. Oh, a villager decided to run up on a cultist and take a few swings at him with a farm implement or whatever, blacksmith tool. You don't need to roll the dice to decide what happens there. You can just say you see some commoners fighting back. They land a hit, then they get hit, and then they fall. I mean, that's fine. You don't have to give them a spot in the initiative order or anything like that. What I would suggest is that a really good tool for every DM to have is just a list of names, pre-generated names that you can tack on, give to an NPC, and then cross it off. And I would designate a couple of those for NPC commoners that the PCs might interact with. Like, here are a couple who fight, here are a couple who flee, here are a couple who freeze. And if the PCs choose to interact with, I want to go up to someone who's frozen, or I want to go up to someone who's fighting and help them, then you've got those names, and you never know, those might become recurring characters. Maybe maybe they are residents of the town who you can go back to later for information, or they are really grateful and they give you some very small token reward, or some such thing. You've rescued someone, they're eternally grateful, they're going to give you information. They might become lasting fixtures in your campaign. But even if they don't, at least for that moment, you've put a name with the face. And let's be honest, your PCs are not going to go up to every single person who's frozen and have a conversation with them. At most, they might go up to one, maybe two. They probably won't go up to any at all, but if they do, at least you're prepared.
I'm having very strong flashbacks to Carrying Crown, Jonathan, where I was playing that with our friend Stalker and Freya, who's hanging out in the chat today. And I distinctly remember Freya's character ending up having this interesting little bond with this boy in the village. And she's like this big, scary half orc. Ogre?
Half orc, yeah.
Half orc. And she's like trying to be really like friendly to this boy, and like it's this really awkward conversation, and it ends up being hysterical, and like ends up being a major character growth moment for her down the line, which was really kind of funny.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something there about commoners being sort of the flavor of most good world building. Which you maybe don't think about in general when you're playing these games, or even when you're playing video games, and there's the NPCs you interact with, but when they're not there, or when they are very just one-dimensional billboards, you feel it. Like you can tell the difference between like a really fleshed out world and just one that just sort of exists for the passing moment.
And getting back to the fight, flee, freeze question, another thing that I go into in the Monsters Know is the concept of ability contours, which is the pattern of high and low numbers in a creature's ability scores, which gives you a sense of what kind of role they're going to play in combat, whether they're going to be a melee tank, a sniper, a skirmisher, long-range spellcaster, short-range support spellcaster, what have you. And
just to clarify,
of course,
are you talking NPCs in general, like any monster?
I'm talking all monsters,
Okay.
all NPCs.
So not just commoners.
Right. Well, the notable thing about the vanilla commoner is that they have no ability contour. It's a completely flat line 10s across the board. But that's assuming that they're human. If you apply a racial template to them, now suddenly their ability contours have some bumps in them. And so you can tweak the settings on your fight, flee, freeze equalizer. Let's take the mountain dwarfs, for example.
Yes, please.
They get bonuses to strength and constitution. That is going to set them up to be to have an ability contour that is a melee brute ability contour. It's a fairly flat melee brute ability contour, but it's still a melee brute ability contour. It's got its peaks in strength and con. So mountain dwarves are going to be much more likely to fight than to flee or freeze. Also, they have their weapon training. So even the most untrained mountain dwarf is still going to be trained to use a hand axe. A simple weapon, not martial, but they all know how to use a hand axe. So in any kind of scenario where you have a lot of mountain dwarf commoners, like you're in a mountain dwarf stronghold, you're in a mountain dwarf village, wherever, maybe a few of them might flee or freeze, but most of them are going to be charging out with hand axes. High elves, they've got the boost to dexterity, plus they have the cantrip. So what you're going to have there, and they've got the elf weapon training with the bows. Now, longbows are a martial weapon, but short bows are not. They're a simple weapon. So if something happens in a village of high elves, you're going to have a lot of those commoners lurking behind cover, shooting with their short bows, maybe tossing out Ray of Frost or Firebolt. They're going to be willing to fight because they are equipped to do so. Wood elves, they have Mask of the Wild. They're going to be using trees to hide behind. They're going to be shooting those short bows with advantage. Forest gnomes, something terrible comes into the forest gnome village. What's going to happen? Poof, they are all going to use Natural Illusionist to turn into rocks, shrubs, giant mushrooms, what have you. They're going to just vanish.
So part of what really what you're saying is that statistics, we can look at a monster stat or a commoner stat, and it can inform a bit about their fight, flight, or
freeze,
stand mentality.
Exactly. So with humans, because they are flat across the board, you're going to see a pretty roughly equal distribution among the three. A 1/3 fight, 1/3 flee, 1/3 freeze. But when you get into the other races where these numbers are modified, it's not going to be an even split anymore. And in fact, there might be, as in the case of mountain dwarves or half-orcs, a very pronounced tendency to fight. Or in the case of forest gnomes, a very pronounced tendency to freeze and hide.
So do you think this has changed edition to edition? Because one of the things I did is went back and looked at sort of the evolution of commoner as a creature, right? And I'll keep it brief, but in early D&D, like the very first D&D, we really don't. I mean, we get commoners are sort of listed under the general heading of men. And, they're given some hit dice and stuff, but things are all a lot more deadly back then. So commoners actually really do have that feel back then of, hey, if you have a village of these things, they really can swarm and take you down. And then in third edition, commoner actually becomes its own class. Like it's a class with which you can attach feats to and build up like any other monster. It's here where I think we start to first get that flatness you're talking about, where the class is just not as good as other classes.
Well, I don't really make any representation about previous editions. Because of my own history, I first learned to play AD&D. I stopped playing Dungeons and Dragons shortly after the second edition came out. Not because of any kind of shortcoming I perceived in the second edition, but because I was just less interested in that and more interested in other genres, Shadowrun in particular at that time. And I didn't come back to D&D until 5th edition. So I really know nothing about 3 or 3.5 or 4 except by hearsay. And so really when I talk about these things, it's in a very, very narrowly 5th edition context. I'm sure there have been changes over the years, but to be honest, the earlier editions I played, at that point, I was too young and my thinking too underdeveloped to examine it critically. And so I don't really put forth any opinion on that.
So I guess then what I'll ask about 5th edition is the commoner, even a huge number of these things, I shouldn't call people things.
I'm hearing a lot of things talk as we're talking about all these NPC characters.
Sorry, I'm used to beholders and mind flayers.
Yeah. These are people, John.
So
people.
Even a huge number of these flatlined people, they don't pose much of a threat really to anything in the world of, I mean, to player characters, definitely not.
You don't think so? You say this, but if each one is rolling a d20 to hit, and they, even if they only have like even with no bonus, a third of them are going to hit you and then get a 1d4 damage. Like, I don't know about you, but I play a lot of wizards, and that's a solid amount of damage if you're going against 20 people.
But you've also got Fireball, which can kill like 30 of them in one hit.
Yeah, assuming.
So 5e offers a couple of different ways to look at this problem. One is the mob rule, the mob attack rule in the Dungeon Master's Guide.
Right.
In Chapter 8, which lets you resolve an entire load of creature attacks if the creatures are all the same type. Just by averaging across the board and declaring that average to be what happened. You get rid of the dice rolls and you say, there are 12 of these people, 4 of them hit you, and then apply the damage. But another kind of funny way to do this is if you want to represent them as a mob, not just as a large number of people using this rule that's named after mobs, but an actual mob,
swarm.
The masses. There is a template floating out there on Reddit for taking any monster stat block and creating a swarm from it. So you can create a swarm of commoners. It would be huge in size, 3 by 3.
It would smell really bad.
It would have 6d12 hit points, strength 15. It would be, as a swarm, it would be immune to the charmed, frightened, grappled, paralyzed, petrified, prone, restrained, and stunned conditions.
Oh, man. Mob mentality, yeah.
And it would have +4 to hit and do 2d8 bludgeoning damage. But for it to hit you, you would have to be in the midst of it. It can swarm over you and share your space, basically surround you, engulf you. And if you're dealing with a situation of absolute, utter civil disorder, that might be a way to go.
Oh, that's actually okay. So you guys are gonna remember this, Kayvon. I have your number, Kayvon. But we have talked a lot about them as sort of, attackers and things. Another thing I want to make sure we touch on is actually, the commoner not as a combatant, but the commoner as a cultural thing, as the commoner as a world building tool. Before we
Yeah,
go,
Mamba mentioned something earlier that he looks at the commoners as flavor text for the setting that he's in.
yeah, and I think I mean, the commoner, our idea of the fantasy commoner obviously comes from our understanding of our romanticization of the medieval peasant. When the medieval peasant life was actually very much one of slavedom. Serf, you were either a serf or a slave. And then, freeman was a very far away goal for peasants, but most people just lived their life working the land of a lord. And one of the things that actually created sort of the medieval cities and brought the peasant out of just into the focus of the lords was the Black Death, which killed so many peasants that finally they had sort of buying power because there was a limited number of them. And if one refused now to do to work your mill or work your land or do the crops, you didn't have a ready supply of people to replace him. And so suddenly the commoners had power. And this is when they started really building cities and towns and villages in the way we think of them in, Tolkien and Game of Thrones and all these things. That's when they started to assert themselves. And then these towns became centered around tradesmen who eventually, that gave them economic power. And with that, they were able to challenge lords and say, well, we're a free city. And that's kind of how that all emerged. So I was kind of looking at Dungeons and Dragons and kind of trying to figure out, well, we know how these emerged in the real world. But in Dungeons and Dragons, how did the commoner reach where they are? And the thing that really I think makes commoners in Dungeons and Dragons very different in terms of banding together and making cities is everything is done out of safety because they're living in an incredibly dangerous world. So,
I mean, mimics, just under your chair. Who knows?
That's right. You can't even sit
Your chair is a
down.
mimic.
Well, to expand on that, peasants, serfs, but not just peasants and serfs. Commoner is really a template for anyone who is not an aristocrat and who is not otherwise trained in some kind of combat. So it can represent any sort of artisan. It can represent laity in the church. It can represent beggars and mendicants. It can represent vagabonds. It can represent, and that's just in the conventional Western European setting that you think about that a lot of people's D&D campaigns sort of default to. If you go into other countries as well, then you have different castes, or you have societies that are less caste bound. There's
Yes.
any number of different ways to interpret commoner. But I would say that the baseline is that they are somebody who is not specially trained in something that the pillars of D&D consider significant. So they don't have any kind of significant combat ability. They don't have significant exploration
Magical
ability. They
abilities.
don't have significant magical ability. And they probably don't have any significant ability in social interaction in a sense that would give them power or privilege within the world. Now, that doesn't mean that they cannot be very interesting characters to interact with on a personal level, or because of what they know, or because of the services they provide. Just that they, for example, are not experts in deception. They are not skilled performers enough to make a living from it. That would probably be a different template. But they're not pirates. They're not soldiers. They're not priests. They're not any of these other categories of training that are special enough to merit their own stat block. They're just folks.
Well, you mentioned the noble in your article. I think you combined the commoner and the noble in that one, what the monsters know what they're doing.
Yeah. Because the station of the noble gives them a little bit more ability, a little bit more skill, a little bit more opportunity, a lot more opportunity. So they are a little bit different from the commoner. There are lots of stat blocks that are a little bit different from the commoner, even though they're not particularly powerful. Bandit, acolyte, what have you.
Just some level of specialization.
Exactly. Yeah. A commoner, pretty much by definition, is not specialized. They're just folks
living their lives,
trying to.
Effectively, the ether by which all heroes rise up from, right? Like I think there's a reason why there's a lot of people out there trying to figure out how to play commoners or how to. Because effectively every hero starts off as a commoner, and that's sort of the prologue of their adventures. Like, who are you? How did you get to this training? You're now level 1. Where do you go from here?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I mean, we've had plenty of NPC commoner characters that either ended up becoming recurrent characters or actual potential major plot points or player characters even. So that checks.
Yeah, and you also want to distinguish between the commoners who are window dressing, basically, those who exist to describe the setting by showing it, and the ones who are just helpless victims when the dragon attacks greenest or something like that. And then there are the ones who, for some reason, stand out. You went to them for information. You have a favorite merchant. But not only that, sometimes commoners become combat objectives. When you think about the role that a monster or an NPC plays in combat, they are not just allies and enemies. There are lots of other positions that one can play in a combat encounter. And actually, a lot of these positions, commoners are more suited to playing these roles than any other stat block you're going to find in any published book. They can be somebody you need to protect. They can be somebody you need to rescue.
Oh no, an escort mission.
They can be somebody you need to catch. They can be somebody you need to stop from doing something stupid.
Usually that's the other players.
Yeah, agree.
Every single one of these is going to add a wrinkle to the combat encounter because it gives you something you have to do besides simply killing or driving off your opponents. It gives you a restriction. It's sort of like a terrain modifier or a weather condition or a visibility condition or something. It's you have to get through this encounter and not let the commoner die, or not let the commoner pull the lever, or not let the commoner get away. Commoners can fulfill this role in a way that really nothing else does.
How is a DM, you're trying to have this world and build these characters for your party to interact with and to have this ongoing adventure story, and how would you deal with a player who instead just doesn't care? How would you go about getting them involved if they're just whatever, I just want to go kill things?
That's an amazing question.
It's a difficult question because there are players who can be made to care and there are players who can't be made to care. And it's hard to do something for the players who can't be made to care.
Kayvon.
Yeah, oh, that's rude. You know what? Hey, I'm just going to jump in. These games are meant to be played by player characters and are by your friends that you're playing with. If you have a friend who wants to play a hack and slash, then maybe that's the game that they should be playing, and you shouldn't. You don't necessarily have to force them into some sort of dialogue with every NPC. I don't know.
I mean, if nothing else, you can always fall back on the material reward. You are doing a job. You're getting paid for that job. If the commoner dies, or if the commoner gets away, or if the commoner pulls the stupid lever, you don't get paid, or you get paid less, or what have you. You can also just let the consequences follow. Maybe because you didn't rescue the commoner or protect the commoner or stop the commoner from pulling the stupid lever, maybe really bad things start happening.
Don't push the button, Kayla.
Yeah, or a piece of information you need you don't get because you weren't engaging with the characters of the world.
Yeah.
Consequences may apply. Now, unfortunately, the poor commoner doesn't get to. Well, if the commoner pulled the lever, then they're still around to see what the consequences were. But it's the players for whom the consequences have to matter. And maybe you make them care the next time by showing them this time the fact that they didn't care meant things went horribly, horribly wrong for them as well as for others. Speaking of things going horribly wrong, there are certain monsters that are tailor-made to exploit commoners.
Oh, interesting.
The one that comes immediately to my mind because I used them this way is the intellect devourer. Now, the intellect devourer.
Oh, yeah.
All right. If you look at the stat block, they really don't have much of a chance of taking over the brain of a PC. It's the bar to clear is just too high. But they can take over commoners very easily.
Oh,
And
that's so evil.
I wrote a whole side adventure for my Tyranny of Dragons group. I foreshadowed this. I sprinkled in clues from early on. The entire area that they were traveling in was suffering from a shortage of salt. And this became something that my players were obsessed with. I had one of my why is there no salt? One of my wife actually, who plays in my campaigns, her ranger started hoarding salt wherever she could find it and selling it at a giant markup. And one day they finally make it to Waterdeep, a market square, and they see that there is a merchant there who has managed to get his hands on a large amount of salt, and people are lined up to get it because they just haven't been able to get it anywhere else. And one guy marches straight up to the front of the line and offers the merchant 40 gold pieces for the entire load. And when the merchant balks, he offers him 45 and then ups it to 50. And finally, the merchant's greed gets the better of him and he takes the money and runs. The people who've been waiting in line are outraged, form an angry mob, pile on this guy, and beat him to death before the party can do anything about it. And then from the scrum, out jumps this brain on 4 big pawed feet, running like hell.
Oh my God.
And boy, did they want to follow up on that. And it took them to a village where roughly 1 in 4 people had been taken over by intellect devourers. The rest had been charmed and basically brainwashed. And there was no way for them to tell which was which. And they found a really ingenious way to solve that problem and figure out who the intellect devourer hosts were and who were just innocent bystanders, and kill the hosts while leaving the bystanders alone. It was magnificent. I was wildly impressed by how they did it.
Oh, you got to tell us now. You can't leave us on that. You got to tell us.
All right, so
The suspense, man.
we had in the party a paladin and a druid.
Yeah.
The druid used locate creature, which didn't tell her exactly where all of them were, but told her how many there were. And then the paladin had, I think it was detect good or evil. No. Is that the name? I'm blanking on it. I think it was detect good or evil.
Detect good and evil, yeah.
Which revealed the presence of aberrations. So he couldn't he didn't have as much range as the druid did, but if he was within range, he knew exactly which ones were the
Intellect of ours.
the possessed ones.
Yeah.
So what was happening is he would call out which ones were the intellect of our hosts. The rest of the party would focus fire on them. The melee fighters would knock them out because they didn't have that many hit points. Then the intellect devourers would run. The ranged attackers would focus fire on the fleeing intellect devourers to pick them off. And then the druid would report how many were left. It was beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful.
And what I love about that is you really did use, this all came from the base of Commoner as a creature, Commoner as a way to build this scenario.
Yeah, because while all this was going on, they still had to deal with the fact that these either possessed or dominated commoners were coming at them, beating on them with farm implements, and so they had to endure this while they were trying to deal with the problem of the intellect of ours. So they are taking these hits from mob attacks the whole time, but they kept their willpower and stuck to the plan, and it worked beautifully. Just as a funny side, I was just at PAX Unplugged, and I had played in a couple of unsatisfying official games, and so I said, you know what, to heck with it, I'm going to run a game. And I think I remember this adventure well enough to just do it by the seat of my pants. And so I rounded up half a dozen people, and we played through this scenario. And let's just say they did not deal as well with with protecting the innocent bystanders. There was a fireball involved.
Oh,
yeah.
Well.
Oh.
We know how that ends.
Yeah. So everybody should look for the DM's Guild adventure. Worth their salt. Is that going to come out sometime?
I never used that title. The title we used was Trouble in Mind, but
which is also good.
It might show up. It might show up one day. I've got my working file, with it laid out. It may show up one day.
One of the things you bring up that I think really is cool is on the bestiary, because we're taking a monster each time. I think we tend to think of monsters in kind of this solo aspect. Like, this is the Aboleth on its own. This is the Mind Flayer on its own. This is the Owlbear on its own. And this is the Commoner on its own. But what you've really explained here, which is a good thing to remember, is that monsters get much more interesting the more you mix and match them. And I never really thought about it, at least not consciously, about how the Commoner can boost the power of these monsters. Like, when we did our Mind Flayer episode, we talked about how the Mind Flayer's power to sort of take over the minds of players has kind of diminished. It's been nerfed a little bit from earlier.
It's been nerfed a lot, to the extent that I felt like when I ran a Mind Flayer, I had to buff it some, because it just didn't seem like it was capable of dominating anything in this environment. So I had to.
But if you think about it, the Mind Flayer's goal is not to dominate necessarily a party of adventurers, but an entire town's worth of commoners.
Exactly.
And that opens the whole scenario up suddenly. So that's really cool. That a really cool place to take that.
And one other thing that we haven't talked about, and I think 5e gives this short shrift, and there are people out there like Matt Colville who've taken steps to try to fill the gap. But 5e doesn't really do anything with henchmen and hirelings, which was kind of a big deal back in AD&D. But there is, if you take the noble background, but use the knight variant, so you don't have position of privilege. Instead, you have retainers. You have 3 followers. The paladin in our party actually took that option, and Sir Paris arrived on the scene in the first adventure, accompanied by his squire Nibble, Babbage the blacksmith, and sister Theodora, his childhood wet nurse. And
Nice.
and they're tagging along with the party the whole time. But this is something you can really use. Don't just let it be a joke that falls by the wayside. There might be an occasion when you have to save Sister Theodora. There might be a situation in which Babbage does something to save you. Now, a commoner as a hireling in a combat encounter may not actually be taking the attack action, but they might be helping you in other ways. They might be passing you things that you can use in the fight. They might be just watching for enemies and calling out their positions. They might be to go in the other direction. They might be hiding under the wagon and shouting at you to save them. But
sometimes it's nice to just have an extra body to carry your stuff.
Yeah, they might be leading the horses away to make sure that the horses don't get killed. There are all kinds of ways that a commoner as a hireling can take part in a battle without actually attacking, casting spells. Although, Sister Theodora was technically an acolyte. She could have cast a little help out spell here and there from time to time. Not enough to swing a battle, but enough to maybe conserve some of the party's resources. She casts Bless so that the cleric doesn't have to. Although technically then she's not a commoner anymore, she's an acolyte. But
maybe she knows mending and she can fix that sword that got bit by the rust monster,
Yeah. A high elf commoner might know Ray of Frost.
One question I have about this is you say, don't let these characters fall by the wayside. What is some advice for a DM who doesn't want to let them fall by the wayside? Not just as far as like they can cast a spell once in a while, but character wise, like how do you as a DM make sure that this isn't just, oh, that's the one who can cast Cure Wounds on me once a day? Because that's kind of how old hirelings often got used,
Yeah.
And more as story elements or like I care about this character.
It depends in part. First of all, it depends in part whether you or the player is the one running the commoner. Like in the situation of Paris and his retainers, he retained. The player was a she. The paladin was a he. Retained ownership over those characters, and so would declare what they did. It was out of my hands. But simply putting them in the situation is sometimes enough, because your typical combat encounter is a bit of a set piece between the PCs and whatever the PC's enemies are. And it's like the entire world outside that battlefield temporarily ceases to exist. Well, you stick your commoner in the middle of that scene, they cannot be ignored anymore. They are something that has to be dealt with. Even if you, as the DM, are not really looking to put them in peril, just the fact that they're on the scene imbues them with significance. And players are going to pick up on that and respond to it. Now, they may not respond in the way you intend them to, but they'll respond in some way. And that's all you really need. And, we're not just talking about dungeon delving here. Encounters can take place like in a village where a whole bunch of people are taken over by intellect devourers. It can be in a city during a monster attack like the dragon attack, or it can be some kind of natural catastrophe.
Yeah, we had a fire in one of ours.
Yeah, maybe there's a fire, maybe there's a flood, maybe there's a blizzard. Something is going on that's incidental to your combat, but that your combat has to take into account. Maybe you have established relationships. There's a commoner you met once before. It might have been a dozen sessions ago, but suddenly they show up again. As soon as you bring that same name back twice, you've imbued that person with significance more than they had before.
Yeah, that's actually a very powerful move for listeners. Anytime you name somebody more than once, bring them back.
That's definitely how I identify commoners worth talking to. Yeah, anyone who's named, they're valuable enough to interact with.
The one who survived your first attack, Kayvon.
I mean, I give names to every NPC my players interact with, but yeah, if they actually came back, it's like, where have I heard that name before? Wait, we know this person, don't we? That person would immediately become of elevated significance.
One thing that we brought up before was, that the idea that like not everybody necessarily can get used to a character, but I do believe that there's an NPC, there's a commoner for everyone. If you could just shape the right personality for your players. And a question I have for all of you, all three of you, is what pops to mind as just right off the top of your head? What is the most memorable commoner you've met, or NPC, towns member? Maybe start with Morgan.
I keep thinking back to the fighter guy that was a Benthies, like that ended up tagging along with a Benthi for a long time in our campaign. What was his name? Xavier Javier?
Oh, yeah. Xavier.
There we go. I heard both. But yeah, he just kind of started out as this dude, and then he evolved into like the Lord of a Keep at some point because he tagged around with us and we did his side quest long enough. And
that was fun.
I don't remember him having a great ending, but he became a serious part of our party for a fairly significant amount of time.
I think he's still alive. I think he was the only.
Did he?
Yeah, I think
He was
the only NPC to survive, I think.
Was he? Okay. I'm having. Wait.
Yeah, he's off Rulina's Keep somewhere.
I'll have to reread the blogs. It's been long enough that I've forgotten the details, but I do remember. He was just a part of our party, and you gave control of him to Tyler, who was playing him, and. So we got to decide, is he going to help out? But if he helps out, there's a 1d6 chance that he's going to die in the process. So it was like, ooh, do we use him or not? And we did the same thing with Varric for Karina. You gave me his little card and I got to decide if I was going to use him or not to block a hit. And it's like, oh God, he almost died. So you got more attached if you have control over that character as part of a party, because they're not your character, but you still bond with them. So, I mean, those were the two that really stuck out for me.
One thing we did, Keith, was just to explain that a bit, was I took index cards and I decided that the players might have more attachment to these hirelings if they were kind of like items that they could use. And so each henchman or hireling had 3 abilities, and one was a once a day thing. One was a kind of a constant thing, and it was usually pretty minimal. It added a little bit of bonus to certain rolls. And then there was one that was a blaze of glory. And if you used this, it had a chance of killing the hireling straight out, but it had some big effect. And so it kind of added in this gambling aspect of the hirelings, where they were this could really help us out. And as they lost more and more hirelings, they left.
Yeah, we lost a few.
They were left with this last remaining one, and they just protected them with their life because they were he's the last one.
Yeah, we got really attached to Xavier.
Kayvon, what about you? Any memorable?
Yeah, I don't know if he officially counts as a commoner or not, but Many Treasures, the little goblin. We had a little goblin sidekick for a little while in one of our games called Many Treasures. That he was pretty useless as a goblin, so I think he would count as a commoner. He was a kobold. Oh, was he a kobold? Yeah, he was useless. Whatever, useless kobold. But he was just so much fun. Yeah, it was a nice little character to interact with that kind of broke up, the dungeon or whatever else. It just added a little bit of world building and nice character interaction.
Well, I would say in our campaign. In our main campaign, the standout NPC, I think, the standout commoner NPC, I think my players would probably agree was Ryan Kellerman, a dwarf from our ranger's home village. So to give you a little background, our ranger in our party is a hill dwarf who, very well into the campaign, revealed that she was actually the chief of her home village before she abdicated and left. And the chieftaincy passed on to her younger sister, and she had been checking in from time to time for news from the village. And this was a very, very caste-bound, tradition-bound dwarven society. And as they were going through the village, they happened upon one of the few non-mudslide buried artisans' buildings, which was a redsmith shop, which, if you're not familiar with the term, is a smith who works in brass, bronze, and copper. And the journeyman in this shop was Ryan Kellerman, who was a much younger dwarf, just a little bit older than our ranger, and who was very cheerful and optimistic and had a great attitude about everything, and thought, unlike the rest of the town who thought that the chief, our ranger's sister, was in completely over her head and was letting everything go to hell, this guy thinks, you know what? She's just getting advice from too many people. If she'd just use her own judgment, she'd be doing just fine. And they all immediately took a shine to this guy. And later on found out that he had been sneaking out of the village, taking skimmed bits of brass and forming them into these little tokens and using them to befriend a local flock of Kenku out in the woods.
Oh, nice.
Who later on the party came across this flock and also plied them with shinies, and they later on became an allied unit when they had to fend off the siege of the goblinoids. So
wow. So that developed into...
There was some fun stuff going on in there.
And again, another great example of how you used a commoner to achieve and build an entire story that didn't require them to be an adventurer, that didn't require them to, have powerful magic.
Yeah. And they become significant just because they're a little bit different from everyone else. I don't think my players met quite a few people in that village. They met pretty much the elders of all the castes, a few other individuals. There was a merchant whose home they stayed in while they were there. And of all of the different people, I bet there are only 2 NPCs they could tell you the names of. Our ranger's sister and Ryan.
That's excellent. Well, Morgan, do we have any comments from the Twitch that we've been haven't gotten to?
Not really. Everyone's just kind of chiming in with their own named characters and stuff. John, actually, who was your favorite NPC commoner character?
Many treasures that Kayvon mentioned was definitely high on the list. Just a very unusual NPC, but again, I don't know if he counts as a commoner. I think the first one that pops to my mind is actually somebody that's in the game you're dealing with now. And I'm going to keep this a little bit mysterious, but this is a person who is a commoner who's been long posing as something other than a commoner. And you guys don't know this yet, but you think this person is something else. And I'm running through
the list of characters right now. Like, hang on.
We have a huge list of characters, so I'm not too worried.
Wait, is it somebody that we're currently?
Oh no, I'm not telling you that. Not telling you that. But it's I think the reason that jumps to mind, and I'm sorry I can't give too many details about it, but it achieves a little bit of what Keith's been talking about, where I feel like it transcends the statistics. It means that, and this is something that I really encourage DMs to do, especially newer DMs, as you get used to the idea of what Dungeons and Dragons can be, is yes, when we talk about the bestiary and we talk about these stats, yes, that's what you have on the page to affect your dice rolls. But what a character says to another character, or what a character builds in terms of their economics or their trade or their relationships with other characters goes far beyond those stats, and can create much bigger stories, just like the one Keith has been so wonderfully sharing with us tonight.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. Because sometimes the most broken statted characters end up being the most entertaining ones. So,
have any of you guys played or tried to play commoners as a character class, or at least started playing as commoners before sort of evolving into your final player character?
I did. I played just for fun in Pathfinder. I played a character who was a squire to one of the other player characters. And I did it just because I wanted to try to play a character for more story than combat ability.
Yeah, it feels like a really good way to sort of build up sort of a rapport with the character, a little bit more of a storytelling before the combat starts.
It was fun because it took some of the focus away from fighting. And my character actually ended up surviving for a really long time because the other players, again, kind of as Keith has said, my character became this focus where it's like, we got to protect that guy because he'll die. He'll die in a single hit. So, Keith, have you had an experience playing a commoner?
I haven't. Again, I wasn't around when commoner was a character class, so I never had that experience. I thought
they were a character class in 5e.
No,
I thought they were created as a. Don't they let them be a? I know there's definitely modules. Like I think what is this one? I found the What's Past is Prologue, which is a module for 5th edition, but for Eberron, which allows you to play. It's like cool. You play as a 0 level character in 5e, and then you can level up sort of into a more of a full character based on the decisions you make.
That's really cool.
I have the Eberron book, but I've yet to crack it open yet. I've been busy with other things, so I'm looking forward to looking into that. But I have had the privilege of playing lots of commoners as a DM. But yeah, so far my experience on the other side of the table is pretty limited. I've been the eternal DM mostly since I started playing 5e.
Well, does anybody else have any questions for Keith? Any last questions?
Yeah, I'm curious. Yeah, I'm curious actually. You were talking earlier, Keith, about your about the blog and about articles that were sort of like Reddit was a big source of people coming, etc. What's been your if you know, your most popular or like most viewed sort of blog, and have you gleaned anything about is there like a particular monster that everyone's in? Yeah, exactly.
Hags. People want to know what to do with hags.
Wow.
Runaway number one, and has been for a long time. Even having written the Hag Tactics article, I still kind of feel like other people have more of a handle on them than I do. I think because hags are not a monster I have made extensive use of, especially in the adventures I've written myself.
They're very complex. in terms of their
really
mentality.
are.
And
are they just witches, or what are hags in D&D?
Well, now we're getting into a whole other Bestiary episode.
No.
This is part two.
Okay, I'll look it up.
No.
But that does lead me to one last question, Keith, because we kind of mentioned that, you do get into the psychology of these monsters so intensely, which is one of the reasons I think hags is probably tough. But getting into just the psychology of commoners, going back to that's kind of how we started tonight. What is your thoughts on like the daily life of a commoner in a world of magic and adventurers and dragons and liches? Like how do you think magic changes psychology?
My opinions on that are part of the reason why I run a pretty low magic campaign. in the campaigns that I run, magic is scarce. It's mostly bespoke. Magic items are not available over the counter, other than if it's not a common magic item, you can't buy it in a store. And even if it is a common magic item, you got to be in a big city to find a store that sells it. Probably a big city with a wizard's college that is creating those things to fund its activities.
Super cool.
Most people have very little day-to-day contact with magic. What contact they have is with a local priest or hedge witch or neighborhood magic user who happens to do favors for his neighbors or perform little services for pay. The average person probably would never encounter a magic item rarer than common or a spell higher than first level, and probably they would only encounter people using cantrips. Anything more rare or more high level than that would be something they'd be talking about for months.
Because of the psychology, that just how this would change them.
Because it exists, but it's still so uncommon that it's something. It's just like earth shaking. It would be like if it would be like if your hometown were the site of a battle in an ongoing war, or if a major celebrity just showed up in your downtown and started walking around, or if you unexpectedly saw a demonstration of some cutting edge technology. Magic in D&D is basically technology. I think of D&D is never really attached to a particular time in real world history. It's sort of a mishmash continuum of things from the medieval era and even before the medieval era, all the way up to the Age of Sail and the just before the Industrial Revolution. In my mind, I peg it as the cusp between the medieval era and the Renaissance era, in which technology in the Renaissance era is supplemented by magic. So that the kinds of things that people were discovering in the Renaissance era, like gunpowder, rudimentary steam power, that sort of thing. Oh, and also we've discovered how to do magic. That kind of, and we've refined it to a certain level that makes it practical at certain levels and an interesting area of study at higher ones.
And why do you prefer that level of mentality?
I prefer that because it keeps magic special. When magic is everywhere, it's just another kind of, it's too easy to take for granted. It's not special anymore. If it's everywhere, it's not special. So it has to be, and for the same reason, I mean, Waterdeep's not going to be raided by dragons or every week. It's
we hope not.
A dragon showing up over Waterdeep is maybe a once per decade occurrence and scary as hell. It's not something people have a chance to get jaded by.
Or develop defenses for.
Yeah, I mean, they might have some limited defenses based on the last dragon that came through 10 years ago, but people's memory of that last incident might not be quite as sharp as it would be if it happened more often. They might forget some important details in that time. I think that if you want to keep magic special, now player characters, by virtue of the fact that they have so much more access to magic by digging it up out of the world, and so much more contact with unnatural beings by going out and rooting them out of the places where they have nested, that makes the player characters themselves a little bit awe-inspiring. And when they are walking around, people should treat them as, these are, if they have any kind of reputation that has spread, which basically means if they're like 5th level or higher, they are one of those rare things like magic or a monster, and people will behave toward them accordingly. They'll probably show deference. They will maybe show a little extra caution. I mean, when you think about the impact that divination and charm spells can have, I mean, really think about it, then what you realize is in a society where these things exist, anyone who has the money and the access will have protective charms against those things, because my God, you do not want any of that done to you.
Definitely something worth keeping in mind as a DM.
It would be seriously in a city like Waterdeep, that's going to have a cosmopolitan city with a college of magic.
Yeah.
Every aristocrat in that city who can afford it is going to have protective charms against divination and enchantment spells. Yeah, because that would be a constant threat and a terrifying threat to them, to know that any time somebody could be controlling your thoughts or reading them.
Ugh.
That should give everyone the creeps. I mean, when you really, so going back to my earliest days playing Dungeons and Dragons, I have a very good friend. He and I are still close after more than 30 years. Who has just this terrific, fertile imagination, who can come up with just mind-boggling things. And I'm creative, but I'm not that kind of creative. That's not the kind of creativity I have. I'm more of a remixer. And so when I want to do something that's going to impress him, I can't do it by being original. I do it by being convincing. I do it by putting in all the details that make a thing feel more real. And so I give a lot of thought about to how these kinds of things would work, and what kinds of ripple effects they would have.
And that is one more reason that I encourage everybody to go check out what the monsters know what they're doing. You can read it free online on Keith's blog. And if you like it, I highly encourage you to pick up his book by the same name. It's exactly what he's talking about. It goes into depth on what these monsters, how they think, and what they would do, and kind of just breathes new life into your pages of your monster manual. And Keith, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to do the same on our podcast today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And just to give a definitive final answer to the question,
yes,
I got to my all-time top posts page, and
oh yes,
runaway number one with 68,700 all-time views, Hag Tactics. Number two is Beholder, and it's not even close. And 3, 4, and 5 are Chromatic Dragons, Mind Flayers, and Vampires.
Wow. Hags beat out vampires. That's crazy.
Hags might have to be on the list coming up, Jonathan.
That's surprising, yeah. Question for Kayvon, because I know your playstyle is a little different than mine. Like, are you less inclined now to just gallivant into a village and
there's a lot of talk,
which
I'm not going to put any credence to. I don't know why Jonathan keeps describing me as like some sort of hack happy brute. I tend to play like rogues who hide in the shadows,
so that they can stab people in the backs.
Yeah, well, but I don't go around molesting commoners. Like it's not that's not my MO.
I think in my I gotta say, I think in my time with you, I alone have seen you punch like a commoner in the face in every game we played.
Well, you know,
mean, it's great. You do a good job.
I feel like I'm playing the character every time. I feel like I'm playing the character every time. I thank you, Keith, for coming out and
you're welcome.
for doing this with us. We definitely
one more
appreciate
thing to mention before I go.
Please.
On D&D Beyond, if you have memberships there, you can find in the homebrew archive a feat that I created, a homebrew feat called Well Connected. You form lasting relationships wherever you go, in any location you've been to previously, in actual play or backstory. Once per long rest, you may announce the existence of a prior acquaintance with a +5 modifier to one skill, tool proficiency, or language proficiency of your choice. Unless the acquaintance's precise location is established, e.g. a permanent shop, a guard barracks, a wizard's college, you must succeed on a DC 10 intelligence investigation check to find the acquaintance. When you encounter the acquaintance, make a DC 15 charisma check. On a success, the acquaintance is friendly and happy to help. On a failure, the acquaintance is indifferent and requires payment. On a failure of 5 or more, the acquaintance is hostile and you must make amends.
That's super cool.
So if you're looking for ways to bring commoners into your adventure in significant ways, let one of your PCs have access to this homebrew feat.
And speaking of products you have, do you have anything else you want to give a shout out to coming up that our listeners should know about?
Just Live to Tell the Tale coming out in June, and also the paperback version of The Monsters Know What They're Doing is due out in May, both in time for Gen Con.
Awesome. And again, I highly encourage people to check out the blog and purchase these books. They are well worth your time and money. All right. Morgan, you want to sign us out?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, everybody, again, for hanging out and watching the Bestiary or listening to the Bestiary if you are at our audio podcast. Do we have our next monster pick, John?
We do. It's finally Shambling Mounds with Freya.
That's
at long last.
Freya's next. Freya is gonna rock us into spring with a plant monster that I've never heard of until she mentioned it.
You guys got briefly attacked by one.
Can I sing you my Shambling Mound song?
Oh, please.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Lord, I was born a shambling mound. Always looking like I just come up out of the ground. Whenever I go to a party, suddenly no one's around. Oh, I was born a shambling mound. Thank you. Written by Ketih Ammann, age 18.
Bravo.
If my video was working, you'd see I'm crying. I'm laughing so hard.
And on that note, we'll be back with Freya's Shambling Mound, I believe February 26th.
January 26th.
January 26th. I am losing track.
That's stuck in my
months.
head. I'm a shambling mound.
You're welcome.
Oh, man. Thank you so much. It was a joy to have you. And hopefully you guys have some wonderful tips moving forward with commoners in your game. And if you do, please tell us. We'd love to hear. Until next time, we were the Bestiary. See you later.
Take care.